going, man?
Awesome.
Thanks for coming on, Will.
Yeah.
All right, so Bojorques.
Yep, you got it.
William Bojorques. Yeah, thanks for coming on. Give your time and so what do you do again?
I work for a federal land management agency.
Nice.
And I work in wildland fire.
Okay. And how long you been doing that?
This will be the end of my 16th season.
Holy shit.
Yep.
So I know you went to college. Did you get right into that right after college?
The reason I got into this is because I was going to school up here. I was going after a zoology degree, which I have not completed yet, and kind of ran out of money. But I kind of fell into fire management. First, I was working on a fuels crew, and I did a couple seasons of that as a summer job, and while I was still going to school. And I took a break for a little while. I wanted my summers back, but then I came back on in 2005 working for what we call a Type 2 initial attack hand crew. And I started my career and ran with it ever since.
Yeah. Well, let me pause right there because we can talk about fire all day, but I want to get back into something that I don't know about you. So how did you find AHSU? Where did you come from? And why did you pick AHSU?
I was going to high school out by Fairfield by Travis Air Force Base.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I graduated high school in Rio Vista.
Okay. Yeah. You know exactly where that's at. It was Vanden High School, and went to all 4 years there at that school and a couple years of middle school before that. But my family moved around all over the place. I was born in Stockton, California, but we lived
military?
No, he worked for United Airlines, my dad.
Okay.
And so we were in Tucson, Arizona, a million places in California, Colorado, Michigan, Wisconsin, and finally back to California. So, and then I applied to one college up here, HSU. I was trying to get a zoology degree. And
it's the only one you applied to?
It's the only one I applied to. I wanted to stay in the state but be as far away from home as possible. And so it was either moved to Southern California or Northern California, so I picked this one. And actually, HSU at the time was one of the few colleges that offered zoology as a major. I knew right away that's what I wanted to do. I came up here for school. And
why zoology to begin with?
I was really good and liked sciences in general, but specifically biological sciences, and I had a passion for animal husbandry and animals in general, like just like working in a zoo or like working for like National Geographic or something like that. That would have been my dream job at the time, and so that was a path to those jobs.
Okay, cool. And then so during HSU, that's when you kind of find.
Yeah, I was I was a chairperson for a club on campus called the Intercept, which was Indian Natural Resource Science and Engineering Program. And a gentleman came in from the Bureau of Land Management who was doing some recruiting for summer work, and it was fuels crews that they just had funding for. And I got his information and signed up with that. It was a pretty easy process, and I reported for duty in Northeast California, Modoc County in Alturas. That would have been early June of that year, which I think was 1998. And then I did one season there, and then went back to school and did another season. And then, like I said, I took a break for a while.
And what got you back into the fire?
Like I said, I didn't complete my degree. I was financially dependent, and I didn't have enough to get through, and I needed to work. So I was on the lookout.
How was it back then?
How much?
How was it back then for HSU? Because I know now, it's a huge issue with student debt and things like that. But back in 1998, things were a little different, no? Or were the same?
It was definitely a lot cheaper. But for the time and place, people weren't making as much money either. So
right, all the numbers were just smaller.
But I ended up like $10,000 in debt on student loans, and I'm still paying those off. And but I'm getting narrowing it down, getting closer, whittling it away. It was. I think tuition there was for per semester was under $1,000. That's like 10 times that much now or something.
Yeah, but it's all relative.
Exactly.
For inflation and things like that.
Yeah, but So I was looking for work, and I ended up on a trails crew at Redwood National, Prairie Creek Redwood National Park. And that was a seasonal job. It was through the winter time. So over December, January, February, and then ran to, I want to say like April. And so I knew that job was going to be coming to an end, so I was looking for other work. And I went to a job fair in Eureka at Redwood Acres, and it was a Forest Service job fair, and ended up, working for them. So I got on that year as, early 2005.
Right on. You've been, so that same thing ever since? And so how were the fires back then? Like, I was barely an adult back then. So
yeah. Well, first when I was in 98 and 99, when I was doing that, it was because I was on a fuels crew. Their primary function was fuels reduction. So they were going out, and our mission was mostly like thinning juniper stands that had encroached into the lower elevations, because they're normally like a higher elevation tree, typically.
Juniper stands?
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean stands?
A forest, a juniper, stand of trees, basically. So we spent, we were working 410s then, so 40 hours a week, and sometimes with some overtime, just going out there and thinning them. Then there were some other bigger projects, and then every once in a while, when they really needed some extra help, we were trained to do fire. Fuels is still within the fire management, world, and so everybody that's in fuels is trained to do wildland fire suppression as well. And so we went out and helped out with a few fires, but that first year was probably, I don't know, maybe we went to like 5 fires or something like that. And the second year I did it, I went to probably about double that, 10. But I got the bug. I really liked it. And then once I moved into fire suppression, where that was your primary duty, I went to dozens of fires after that.
What attracted you to it?
It's really exciting. It's a lot of fun. It's adrenaline. It's physically demanding. It requires you to stay in shape. They pay you to stay in shape. Usually like an hour a day, you can do PT, and it's on the clock. And then you get to see some really exciting places, really remote places. Because I work for a federal land management agency, the jurisdiction is all federal lands across the United States. So I've been to almost every western state for fighting fire, and some states back east and the south. And it's not just fire. We do all risk management. So sometimes we get dispatched to like hurricane relief or flood relief and that kind of thing. So our expertise obviously lies in wildland fire. But we're pretty handy with chainsaws, so that comes in handy for like hurricanes and wind damage events and things like that. We're also just
hack into buildings and things.
What's that?
Having to hack into like buildings that have been torn down and things.
No, we do have a policy that we don't enter
residential.
Burning buildings or damaged buildings, that kind of stuff. So if they're actively burning, or unless it's like a extreme life-threatening situation where somebody's going to die, we can do that. But normally, if there's there's nothing at stake, we're not going to enter the building. That's the wheelhouse of structure firefighters. So it's at 2 different camps.
Interesting. And so, because the vocabulary is starting to like get weird, like juniper stands. But when you're talking fuel, you're talking like just like dead logs, right? Or you're
fuels,
talking like actual gas.
Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah. Get a little carried away sometimes. But I teach a fire class, and like half the class is me just explaining that jargon.
What? Yeah.
But for us, fuel, in terms of fuel, it's anything that burns. So it's living and dead vegetation.
Okay.
But it could be a house. It could be a human being. Anything out there that can combust is we refer to as a fuel.
And your approach is obviously different depending on the type of fuel.
Absolutely, yeah. It varies widely across the country, and we organize fuels into different fuels classes. And in that regard, we're talking pretty much specifically vegetation, both live and dead. And the original fuel classifications were very simple. It would be like grass with shrubs, just shrubs, timber overstory, and then a timber understory. So varying like whether they have just needle cast on the ground, small branch wood, or actually like here in the redwood forest, it'd be more of a timber overstory where it has like brush and small trees under the understory. And then the final category is like slash, either like blow down from wind events or from logging activities. So really high concentrations of fuels, really large diameter stuff laying on the ground. And so everything like fire that moves through grass moves, if it's dry, very quickly. And usually those like wind driven. But it's also easy to spray out with water, as you might imagine,
Less dense.
And then on the other side of the spectrum, you got like your slash blowdown laying on the ground, large diameter logs and such. Once that starts combusting, it's very labor intensive to be able to put it out. You can't just splash a little water on it and it won't go out. You think about like, trying to put out a fire in your fireplace, trying to put out a campfire or a bonfire. The larger the material, the more effort you got to put into it to actually get it to stop combusting.
But then it's not going to move as quickly.
No, yeah, it's usually what we refer to as like a long residence time. So it's going to burn in one place very slowly but very intensely. It puts off way more heat. It burns at a like much hotter temperature. Flame lengths are taller, but it doesn't usually move very fast. The in between to that would be like shrubs. Burns very like Southern California fires. So chaparral, manzanita, also very heavily influenced by wind, but also slope, and it moves very quickly through those fuel types, even when it's alive. Live fuel moisture is like a critical level for like manzanita. Like I think I'm going to take a stab at it. I think it's like 150% of, 300% is like totally turgid and has all the moisture in it could possibly have. But it gets about down halfway, and then it's really volatile because it has a lot of oil in the plant, in the leaves specifically. So it once you get a little bit of wind on it, a little bit of drought conditions and things like that, it spreads very quickly and at a really high intensity. Usually like if you have 20-foot tall chaparral, and then you could expect to have like flame lengths coming off at least double that, so like 60 feet. And you can't just douse a little bit of water on it.
Right.
You'll slow it down, but yeah.
So then what do you do?
Our typical suppression tactics that we go for is because we don't actually have a lot of water available. It's not like a municipal department where you can tap into a water system and you have basically unlimited amounts of water. When we have water, we use it. We do have fire engines. Our engines, though, are we refer to them as Type 3 trucks, and so they're a little bit smaller, about half the size of like a city engine, and they got taller clearance, big knobby tires on them, and they carry about 600 gallons of water with them. And that's because
that doesn't sound like very much.
It isn't very much, but it's the municipal engines, your Type 1s and 2s, they carry almost no water because they just tap into a system and pump out of there. But at 9 pounds a gallon, 600 gallons of water is pretty heavy. Right. There's water trucks, but they're just for transferring water between water sources and these engines that are out there on the line. But we also have a lot of hand crews, and they're like 20 firefighters, and their expertise is really, really steep ground and really remote areas, basically places where you can't use a bulldozer. If there were places out there where you didn't need, where you had really, really steep ground, but you could use a bulldozer on it, we would use it. It's a lot faster. It makes much wider line. But there's, the existence of rugged territory is the reason why hand crews exist. And then we have aircraft, of course, helicopters and fixed-wing aircraft. We also have wildland fire prevention patrols like myself. That about covers what, different kind of resources we have in general.
Yeah. So, I mean, the broad tactic when you encounter a fire is just to start laying down fire breaks to either access it or kind of cordon off the fire.
Yeah, there's a couple different ways we do it. So mostly it's removing fuel, right? If we have water available, we'll use it, and obviously that's preferable if we have access to it. But so if the flame lengths are, the rule of thumb is they're 4 feet or less, then you can stand next to them for a limited amount of time. and it's what we refer to as like 1 foot in the black. So the black being the burned area, and you remove the fuel in front of the fire. You send chainsaw squads in first, right, and they remove the brush and small trees and limb up the trees and things like that, and then you follow it up with people that dig line with hand tools, shovels, and basically pickaxes we refer to as Pulaskis, and rakes. And usually you do about a 2 foot scrape, and we remove all the fuel down to mineral soil, and sometimes that organic duff layer that's like needle cast and mycelium from fungus and limb wood and everything else. It can be very deep at times, but you got to dig down to. What's that?
Is that flammable?
All of it is, yeah. Mineral soil refers to, it'd be like, in essence, like sand or rock, dirt that doesn't burn, basically. But everything else is.
Oh, well, there it is. That was weird.
Yeah, got a little loud.
Well, hopefully that didn't fuck up the whole thing. I don't know why it did.
Yeah. Well, you want to check it first, or just roll with it?
I mean, there's really no checking it. I don't know why. No idea why it would do that.
Okay. Yeah, I was a little quiet. Was wondering,
Yeah.
But anyways, yeah. So we remove that fuel that's laying on the ground. It can be very deep at times because it accumulates over centuries if fire hasn't gone through there before.
Right.
And what you create is little fire breaks. So you got the fires moving towards it. Not too fast, just creeping along maybe. And once it runs into that line you've built, it runs out of fuel, and therefore it can't continue to burn, right? Mm-hmm. It can throw embers across, especially if you have wind pushing across your line. Again, you're like a campfire or something like that. All those little sparks and embers that come up, as long as they're still lit, they can land at something on the other side of the line and ignite it over there.
How long did you say it was? Like 2 feet?
Usually we shoot for about 2 feet. Sometimes we go much larger. And then, of course, if a bulldozer comes through, it's as wide as the blade, or
right.
Several bulldozers wide. We use natural fire breaks, too, like streams, rock outcroppings, things like that. And then man-made barriers that already exist, like roads. And then we also, we have water or aircraft, we'll spray down wet line or foam, and so it sticks there and stays wet longer on the ground, and then fire retardant out of planes, and then bucket drops from helicopters. For us, though, the federal aircraft don't fly at night. They don't have those capabilities, so it's only a daytime resource. And they're also nationally prioritized, so if another fire breaks out someplace else and structures or lives are threatened, then if you're out in the wilderness with some of that stuff, then they're going to pull your aircraft and send them over there.
Which could potentially be really dangerous.
We prepare for it.
Right.
Even though we have a pretty sizable fleet, and the state has their own aircraft, we contract most of ours. They're a hot commodity, so you run out pretty fast.
Interesting. Yeah. Hopefully that sound thing, man. I don't know. I don't trust it now. Everything sounds kind of weird.
Yeah.
Okay. But anyways,
let's do it over if it doesn't work.
Yeah, that'll work. Okay, cool. And so, right now, are there any jobs that you're working on currently, or that you're anticipated to go out on?
So things are pretty quiet in the nation right now.
Yeah.
We actually had a pretty slow year. It didn't sound like that, especially in California when you had things like the Kincaid fire going on, and some of those fires down in Southern California. But overall, we've had probably our slowest season nationally in almost a decade. And that wasn't the case all over the world or all over the United States. Alaska had a really busy season. The Arctic Circle in general had a busy season, or just further up north. Canada, early on in the season, we sent some crews and equipment there early on. You probably saw in the news that Siberia was having problems with fires, and then also the Amazon and South Africa. And then currently right now, Australia is experiencing one of their worst fire seasons they've ever had right now. So, and of course,
Does Australia have like forests?
Eucalyptus.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's right. They get a bunch of brush type stuff.
Well, it's it's a big place, so
yeah,
there's a lot of desert too.
Yeah. Huh. Interesting. And I mean, like the whole rumor is that like 99% of fires are man-made, right? So these happening in places where there's human.
Well, it's not quite that high, but most fires are human caused, and that's not to be confused with.
The only other exception would be like what, lightning strikes.
Exactly. Okay. Yeah. So, but human causes is like there's a lot of human causes, and arson is only a small piece of that. Arson is like intentional and malicious, right? Or gross negligence, maybe. But there's all kinds of other cause categories. Fortunately, I could talk about that for a little bit too, because I'm a qualified fire investigator.
Oh, really?
But,
oh, yeah.
Yeah. And but lightning is the primary only natural cause. There is spontaneous combustion. It does happen. I've actually been to a couple of them in my career, 3 actually. And then there's some really rare ones like meteorites and volcanic activity. And, well, Hawaii got some fires because of volcanic activity this year. But rare
you said spontaneous combustion?
Yes, correct.
And how did you decipher that?
So there's 2 different kinds. There's chemical and organic. So the chemical reaction is like you were to leave like oily rags in a corner. You know, they're like solvents and that sort of thing. And then you can, with the right conditions and some heat, they can, and as well, especially if you have like a pile of them, because that insulates it there and keeps it hot, then it can get raised to a temperature where you can catch them on fire.
Wow.
You know? And the organic way is the stereotypical thing that happens is like you got like a haystack, and it gets rained on. It's decomposing organic material, vegetation.
So it's heating up.
Yeah, so it's got microbial, bacterial action going on in there where, you know, they're breaking down the cellulose of the plant fibers, but it's insulated against itself. It's a giant haystack. But in the very center, you have this, you know, metabolizing going on, and metabolism makes heat, and that heat has nowhere to go. It's just the colony's starting to grow exponentially, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It starts producing more and more heat till it reaches a point where it ignites the vegetation on the outside. So,
interesting.
Yeah.
So would it, like that organic hay bale effect, would that ever occur in nature?
Yeah, no, it's a little bit more rare in like without, because obviously there's a little bit of human activity to it because we accumulate those fuels, but it certainly could. I feel it's pretty rare.
Yeah.
The 2 that I've been to was a wood chip pile that was like almost 2 stories deep, and it was, you know, been sitting there for years and years and years, and it had the part of the reaction actually requires it to get wet. That helps the colony grow. And then with a little bit of a drying period afterwards.
Right. Because it makes it heavy too, so that more pressure.
Yeah. Well, you need that water to sustain like the chemical reaction, the metabolizing of the breaking down of the plant fibers by those bacteria. The other one I went to was a soil farm, so it was manure, so giant piles of that, and it was, you know, obviously that's another more organic deal that's, you know, flammable in the right conditions.
So are there any regulations set in place to be like, hey, you got a giant pile of crap over there, you need to like rake that thing out?
Not that I'm aware of. It's still a pretty rare event, and it's obviously in their best interest to not let that happen, because that's their product that they're losing. Yeah. You know, same thing with hay bales. But you know, like discarded, you know, wood chips, you know, no one's thinking about that. It's like laying over the hillside.
And so what were the other ones?
So like you mentioned,
I'm just plugging questions.
Oh yeah. No. So lightning, obviously.
Yeah.
And lightning at times can be very, you know, like I think most of the fires that are burning Australia, I think they're lightning caused. And then, you know, certain years we have, we call them lightning busts or lightning sieges, and we have tons and tons of lightning. 2015 was one of those years. Sometimes we get, you know, like a lot of lightning coming through different areas, and they can cause a lot of fires if the conditions are right. Usually those ones are pretty remote as well. Not always, but oftentimes they're out in the middle of nowhere. And then the human cause categories would be like smoking. So anything having to do with smoking, discarded cigarettes or matches and that thing, such like that. Equipment, and equipment's any like motorized equipment. So anything from cars to chainsaws to lawnmowers, you know, that kind of thing. And that's Whether a car coughs out a hot catalytic converter particle, or it rides on the rim, or you're dragging a chain, or you're mowing your lawn, you hit a rock, and that creates a spark. That's all equipment fire. Another one would be campfires, escape campfires. People not improperly extinguishing campfires or abandoning them. That's the whole Smokey Bear campaign kind of like focused on that, at least originally. And then you have debris fires. So especially in rural areas, you have people that burn their vegetation that they've cut down. So they've gone out, they're doing their due diligence to increase their defensible space, and hack back the jungle that's kind of encroaching onto the property, and take that material and make piles and then burn it. But then again, just like a campfire, you gotta stay on it, only burn on days it's safe to burn, and that kind of thing. So we get a certain amount of those every year. What else? We have railroads. Not here locally, but other places, railroads cause fair amount of fires.
Like old.
No, even modern rails.
Really?
Again, you have it's almost could fall in
because of the train going by. And
exactly.
Okay.
So you have metal on metal there, right?
Right.
And so if anything falls across that, it could create a spark, and if the vegetation's not pushed back far enough away from the tracks, it can jump over there and start that, or it can even light the ties on fire, possibly. But also, even though modern locomotives are diesel, and they're supposed to have screens that catch the particles exiting out of the exhaust, sometimes they get a hole in it or something like that, and it can loft and fall into some place where it can ignite. But certainly the old coal-fired locomotives, of the 1800s, those absolutely started fires. And there's still a lot of those historic railroads all over the United States. Colorado recently had one from one of theirs. New Mexico has one. They're all over the country. And so trains, rails are one. I'm trying to do this off the top of my head.
Yeah. So as a fire investigator, so sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not so obvious, the start of it. What steps do you go through to kind of try and decipher what really happened?
So it's without physical evidence left behind, it's very difficult to ascertain the suspect or something out of that.
Yeah. Do you have a forensics team kind of deal, or does it not get that?
We have access to that kind of thing. It's sometimes it could take a lot of time for them to get in there. We have a fire investigation team that's located in Northern California, based out of Redding. So me as just an individual fire investigator, I can request that they assist with that fire. Now, of course, that's something that maybe more driven, we got an arsonist on the loose, and it's damaging property. Yeah. But if I get something that hasn't caused a lot of monetary damage, I'm not going to ask for their help, even though they might be able to give me some evidence that I wouldn't be able to normally pick up.
But it's
yeah. So especially if I don't think that there's a very good shot of getting a suspect. A lot of it's just data collection. So when you first arrive on scene, and I try to get there as close to when it ignited as possible, but that's not always possible. Sometimes I don't get there till the next day. But when you're first showing up there, obviously you're trying to see if there's people fleeing the area that possibly set the fire. Get a vehicle description, description of the person, license plate, that kind of stuff. And then if there's any people on scene, interview them, talk to them, whether they're witnesses or suspects, and just get all the information you possibly can, and try to narrow down a time of ignition, which is really helpful as well. And then if it's not in the middle of nowhere, and maybe you're close to town, if there's security camera footage, sometimes we have game cameras out there that we can look into that too, that were put in place for other reasons, people doing illegal dumping or wood cutting or something like that. But then someone starts a fire and it's on camera. That's ideal, but very rare. And then when you get past that, for me, we have a systematic approach about the fire. So I do a couple laps around it, and I'm looking at what we call macro scale indicators, so fire spread indicators. There's a bunch of variety. of, that shows you which way the wind was blowing and which way the fire was moving, based on, scarring and sooting and staining that's left behind on the vegetation and the rocks and any refuse that was left behind. I'm also looking for footprints. I'm looking for tire tracks. And then if it is an arsonist, I'm looking for maybe if they left a device behind. Something simple like a matchbook, cigarette device, or something more complicated. But typically, arsonists, especially in this area, they do what we refer to as a hot set, which is like basically taking your pocket lighter out, putting it to the vegetation, and not leaving it behind. So it doesn't leave anything. Sometimes they use accelerant, so like gasoline or butane or something like that, and then that leaves behind a residue and something I can collect and send to a lab and confirm that they added some fuel to this, and use that as evidence. So your officer pulls over a car and it matches the suspect's vehicle from there, and then they got a couple cans of butane back there, and we've positively identified that there was butane at the scene of the fire. Then that helps our case.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
sounds like a fun job.
It is. It's a lot more fun when you actually catch somebody.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah. So worldwide fires. So you're tracking fires around the world pretty consistently, or are you just kind of hearing the news?
I'm hearing the news.
Okay.
But we do have like internal, emails and announcements and such, because I don't have a passport at the moment, and I'm gonna need to work on that. But if I did, there is the option, like if they're they really need the help, they'll pull in international help. And we have sent crews in the past. Like I just said, we sent some crews to Canada earlier this season, like back in the late spring.
Mm-hmm.
And so yeah, we can possibly help, and we do send crews, and we get crews from other countries too when we really need help. This wasn't one of those years, but last year was a very busy year, 2018. It's the first year I ever worked over 1,000 hours of overtime. And it was, incredibly busy. And the country, we have a scaling. We call it a preparedness level, and it's 1 through 5, 1 being the lowest, 5 being the highest. And it's a strain on resources. So preparedness level 1 means everybody's at home sitting. We can overwhelm anything that pops up, and then it scales up to where 5 is there's nothing left to give. Everybody's station is manned by a skeleton crew, probably like 1 engine, and then everybody else is committed. And then that's when you bring in the National Guard. That's when you bring in the active duty military, and that's when you ask Australia for help, and they send crews over here to try to assist with things. And we do the same for them.
Yeah. Why do you think this year was pretty slow when last year was pretty busy?
We had an above average winter. Most of the nation did.
As far as temperature, or as far as
rainfall?
Rainfall
and snowpack.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that just helps with the suppression.
There's lots of different reasons why. As you might have remembered, they declared the drought in California over because of this winter we just had, the 2017-2018 winter, and it's a little bit of misleading, because what they use is for declaring the drought being over is snowpack and how full the reservoirs are. And how full the reservoirs are doesn't really affect wildland firefighting at all, except as a water supply to dip out of for helicopters and such. So it's a little bit there, but usually there's not bone dry where you can't get some water out of a reservoir. Snowpack matters to us because it makes the high country unavailable to burn for longer periods of time. So the deeper the snowpack, the higher elevations remain under snow. You don't have to worry about wildfire up there. But some of the years that we've had in the recent past, there's almost no snow up there, even in the dead of winter. And then by the time August rolls around, it's actually probably already been on fire by then. But we've had a lot of activity up there, so it's one less thing to worry about when the snowpack lasts into July, and then arrives early. Say in like October, that would be ideal. And you have like a very short window where those very high elevations are just totally available to actually get wildfire, and then it's not that big of a deal. So in drought years, though, it's totally on the table, and everything else below that elevation as well. The big thing about for us and precipitation and having a good winter is like I've mentioned before with the vegetation. So living vegetation obviously takes up water, and if it's stressed by drought, there's not as much water in there, and so same thing. It's available to burn sooner, earlier in the season, and later into the season, or in our case in California, sometimes year round, and that's really what drives like wildfire spread and in living vegetation. Then also in dead vegetation, that also matters there as well. So you have your small diameter stuff like blades of grass, pine needles, really small diameter things. That gains and loses moisture very quickly within the matter of an hour or so. You can have, like, you think about it like a field that's dry grass, it's dead grass. In the early morning, it's covered in dew, right? You're obviously not going to get that started, right? But you get some sun on it, and within an hour, it could be totally dry. So that's how fast it can lose and gain moisture. So relative humidity, humidity in the air can actually make that fuel available to burn or unavailable to burn. But you can start going up in size classes, logs and such, then you start things that they're only starting to be affected by drought. As you think about a wood pile,
because it takes a lot longer for that cycle.
Exactly. So the larger the diameter, the more hours it takes for it to dry out, and also the more hours it takes for it to get wet. So, cause especially if it's you got rain beating down on a giant log that's like 3 feet on its side, it could be getting poured on, but the very center of that's going to be bone dry, right? And so that's going to be over the course of years, that fuel's moisture is going to change, right? And then everything in between takes less time, right? All the way down to your small class categories of diameter. So drought for us, that large diameter stuff that's sitting out there is still, perfectly dry. And so we need multiple years of good years to like start affecting something like that.
To keep it more damp.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why you said it's misleading.
Yep.
Because the actual water levels is sufficient enough to say that we're out of a drought. But
right.
As far as things being combustible are concerned, we're not.
Yeah, whoever's making that call is doing it on a looking from a perspective of like, people having enough drinking water, people having enough, water to keep their landscaping alive and water crops and that kind of thing. It's for us though, that's not going to affect the vegetation on the landscape.
Interesting. And so what do you think about, if you want to get into the juicy stuff here, what do you think about like the long-term effects and like where we're going?
Well, so there's 4 things that are, driving our wildland fire behavior now. And they're all man manipulated. Okay. So, first one is, logging. The second one is, our fire management policy, which was 100% suppression, since the inception of, the Wildland Fire Service. The third is, development, people moving into the woods and building houses in the woods and things like that. And then the fourth is climate change. And so you go way, way back before Native Americans even settled North America. Wildfires got started by lightning primarily. There's probably a couple other things here and there, but mostly lightning. And, the ecosystem that evolved out of millennia to handle wildfire is every plant's adapted for wildfire in its own special way. And some of it's sacrificial, it just, burns up and then it resprouts from the seed bank, it resprouts from the roots. But because of that constant reentry of fire over the years, and sometimes some places it's every other year, and some places it's every 100 years, and everything in between but it would happen and it would burn through the landscape, but it wouldn't usually kill the living vegetation. It would only clean up the dead stuff that's on the ground, your pine cones, the pine needles, and then the dead grass and things like that. And same thing, Darwin's law, right? The sick and dying trees would burn, and then the snags would burn, which are already dead trees. And, and then maybe it would take out a clump or two of trees here that are living, but especially if it was experiencing drought. But it would, for the most part, it would just clean up the forest. That's how it did business. And so because it would happen in regular intervals, it never built up enough fuel to make super intense fires. There are exceptions, obviously. But and then you have some vegetation that's it relies on fire to reproduce, like lodgepole pine. It has serotinous cones that only open up because they get heat, so they have to actually have flame or heat coming off of the convective column to open the seed cone up and like spread the seeds. And they're kind of like the salmon of the tree species, right? So the adult trees die in the fire, but the next generation gets started. And you have
what kind of trees is that?
Lodgepole.
Lodgepole.
Yeah, lodgepole pine.
Never even heard of it.
Yeah, it's they have them in California, but they're not. They're more kind of closer to the Rockies in the area, but they're all over the West.
Okay.
Yeah. There's other tree species that do stuff similar to that.
Interesting.
And then you have things like palmetto in Florida, which that plant it also has a lot of oil in it. And its critical live fuel moisture is very high, like I mentioned, like manzanita is. So even with a lot of water in the plant, it's still available to burn. And we're talking living vegetation. And fire rips through those palmetto stands, and then in a matter of days, they're just resprouting from the root. So it doesn't kill, the fire doesn't impact the roots because they're subterranean with the heat. It just regrows. It just resprouts. So that's a fire adaptation. Some species are like extremely fire resistant, like redwood trees. Redwood trees will burn. It's perfectly capable, but their bark is very, very fire resistant. So it's and also typically speaking, like an old growth stand of redwood, the canopy is very, very high off the ground, and it doesn't have limbs between the bottom layer and where the crown is. And there's very limited ladder fuels in there. Ladder fuels what allow fire to climb up into the canopy. And
and it's not going to climb up that bark.
No, it's not going to climb up the bark. And because they have a mature stand, it's a closed canopy, meaning there's no sunlight beating through. You have like limited growth and plant species that can survive in ferns, for instance. Yeah. And so it keeps the level underneath those stands pretty low. So if fire does burn underneath, it's not going to do much. It's going to get, it's also very moist. The temperature's cooler. So redwood stands typically resist fire very effectively, old redwood stands. And so that's their strategy for taking care of like wildfire in the past. Excuse me. But of course we changed it, right? So, North America started getting settled by Native Americans, and Native Americans were starting to use fire and use it on the landscape. And so, to improve hunting and stuff like that, they would, set fire to areas and make meadows stay meadows for big game. They also do it for like, for travel purposes, keeping trails and migratory paths open and things like that. So they added some fire to the system, but still in that realm right there, the fire could only do so much. They just increased the intervals in places, and they were selecting for open areas as opposed to stands of timber and things like that. Then
you're talking natives
Native Americans.
Okay.
Yeah. And I'm sure this occurred on other continents too. I know for a fact it happened in Australia with Aborigines, and so human beings were using fire all over the world. And so what changed with that is, settlers from Europe colonizing North America, heading west. You had, people just looking at like timber barrens, these stands of forests out there, and profiting off of turning them into logs and boards.
Yeah, business happened.
Exactly.
Right.
And so what was significant about that is, when wildfire would go through there and it did claim some trees, and especially in drought years, it would, maybe large swaths of trees. They just saw their profits going literally up in smoke, right? And they kind of freaked out a little bit. And this is, basically right around the dawn of 1900, right? And
the
Forest Service
building like log cabins.
There, people were settled in California in the 1700s when the Spanish were there, but they weren't like having like active logging, where they, and then at this time it's like logging was with crosscut saws and double bit axes. Chainsaws hadn't been invented yet.
Yeah,
so
it's just mules.
Mule teams and locomotives, that kind of thing.
Yeah, locomotives. Right.
And also floating logs down rivers and things like that.
Right.
The means and the production obviously increased, but they were still affecting the landscape on a grand scale by logging these swaths, and it was clear cutting in that time. But one of the things was, they were a powerful lobby of the day. The Forest Service was just getting started. This is, when Teddy Roosevelt was president, and Gifford Pinchot was the head of the Forest Service. And so they lobbied them to do something about this. And basically, the tipping point event were the fires of 1910 in Idaho and Montana. And it was a tremendous destructive force. The wildland firefighting wasn't a profession. They pulled guys out of bars and made crews and to try to go put these fires out and things like that. There's no aircraft, no equipment, it's dirt roads and horseback. And so they got a handle on those things, but the timber companies were like, we got to do something about this. So a policy of 100% suppression was enacted by the Forest Service at that time, where if a fire is discovered, they sent people to it to go put it out. And
guaranteed every time.
Mm-hmm. Well, 99% effective. Well, okay. Right. So they started putting lookout towers all over the country, staffing them with people. And at those times, that one person, oftentimes like that lookout, would find the fire, radio it in, drive as close as he could to get out to it, hike the rest of the way in, and he'd go put it out by himself. And he was normally, again, because those conditions I was talking about that don't exist too many places today, where the fire intensity is not going to get too big because there's not a lot of fuel on the ground that's been left behind. It would just low intensity, small flame lengths, and then you'd be able to build some line around it, and then mop it up, dirt, suppress it, and drive back and go fight the next one. And maybe several in a day. And you keep them really small, and that's where you're most effective, where they're less than an acre. Call in some help if you need it. But then once it starts getting bigger than that, those are the ones where we were trying to chase them down for months. And the same was the case back then. So that 1% of fires, couldn't get to it fast enough or had a big wind on it, and found some more receptive fuel beds to get into, and spread got large. That policy was tremendously effective, and it was also backed up with a fire prevention campaign, which originally was Bambi, and then became Smokey the Bear. But basically, you could prevent forest fires, right? So it was, the other cause was still human beings, and take lightning out of the equation. They create a bunch of fires, and so the other most effective tool was preventing them from even happening, right? And so we had that policy for about 100 years. So I said, 1910, that's 2020 almost. We've since changed that policy, but we're still dealing with the aftermath of that suppression policy of 100 years, no fires. And that, because we were so good at it, we've painted ourselves into a corner, so to speak. And going back to logging activity, so there's very few forests in the western United States, and none in the eastern United States, except for like maybe some national parks and things like that haven't been logged. And that includes the federal lands, like not so much the national parks; those are pretty pristine and untouched. But the national forests have definitely, all of them, experienced logging. And first a lot of it was like clear cuts, and then some of it was selective thinning and things like that. But that condition where you're seeing like the old growth redwood forest, where you have high canopies, and that interval of like not having so much fuel on the ground, that doesn't exist in too many places anymore. And then the other natural condition of aboriginal forests is that they're mixed stands. There's not too many monocultures out there where it's just one kind of tree out there, even in a redwood forest. But when you introduce logging to these systems, they would replace the trees once they've cut them all down with
one type.
Well, a tree species that's lucrative, like Douglas fir, right? You wouldn't plant hardwoods back in there like oaks and madrones. You want Doug fir trees, specific kinds of conifers, particularly. And the trouble with that is like, even if they do go back and replant it, it's now a monoculture. It's one type of tree, oftentimes clones of itself. Genetic material very similar, right? They're all the same age and height. And at first, until they improved things and figured stuff out a little bit better, they were planted in rows like corn. And then also because they're trying to maximize profit, put as many of them in there as they possibly can. But trees aren't corn, and this is old news. This happened a long time ago.
Right.
But, those kind of conditions where you would have all these trees in close proximity to each other competing for resources, water and sunlight, so they're all really stressed. There's branches all the way to the ground, like Christmas trees. They're all the same height. And basically, in those stands, until they get a lot older, they behave like brush. It might as well be a bush. Mm-hmm. And so fire would just rip through those things and they still do. The other thing is like they're susceptible to disease and insect attack. So further weakening them and killing them off and things like that. And then you also have, but the one thing that logging had sort of a positive effect on is like sometimes we'll put these, big fire breaks in there. And that was just like short term. And there's sometimes, especially if they're left a bunch of logging slash behind, and that would create a different kind of problem for us. Right. But the other thing that changed, especially you look at like some old historic photos, you find like an old black and white photo of Willow Creek or something like that. And you see like these hillsides, there were a lot more prairies and open areas, and then different stands of trees like oak woodland, which oak trees kind of suppress growth underneath them. Grass can usually grow underneath oak trees, but the tannins and the leaves themselves that's drop down there, it really suppresses the growth of anything else. And so you just have like just grass or nothing, not much for vegetation growing underneath oak trees. So they're really kind of safe from fire in some regards. But oak trees weren't what logging companies wanted, and prairies certainly weren't what they wanted. So when they go back in, they planted all these areas. So instead of having breaks naturally occurring across the landscape, it was just solid trees everywhere. And when you go out there right now, that's not what it looked like back then. So we've manipulated it to a point where, and it was driven by money and we've made huge changes on the landscape. Unfortunately, there's no money in changing it back. Mm-hmm. So we're up against some big problems. The biggest way we can affect it is like trying to let fire kind of get back into these places, and it's going to kill stuff. There's no ways to stop that from happening, especially when the areas are really steep. But it's the most effective, widespread way and cheapest way we can kind of restore the landscape. And we're still figuring out, the best ways to do that too. But of course, fire is dangerous, and here enters development. We don't have places where people don't live anymore. People want to live in rural areas, whole communities of rural areas. If you have like true wilderness, where there's no structures out there, maybe some old cabins or something like that. Those places are pretty rare, like totally open spots. And where those places are, we're making pretty good strides in like reintroducing fire to these systems. And, it's been definitely some tough learning, and some places where, the fire did a tremendous amount of damage, and there's not going to be trees there for a long time. But, in other places too, there's making some pretty good restorative actions to try to get fire back in that landscape, back in that system, so that when a lightning strike happens, you can just let it do its thing. And the trouble being is that, we have borders, right? There's the edge of the wilderness ends someplace, and the other side of that border is, the community of Willow Creek or something like that, right? Or at least some improvements in some structures. And we place a big emphasis on not letting fire destroy these things. And for that, it really ties people's hands about, reintroducing fire back into these systems.
Right.
In the community I work in, it's what's called like a fire adapted community. And so the people that are out there really are getting used to the idea of having fire. And there's civilian folks that go out there and they actually, light their properties on fire and that kind of stuff. They're doing it understory burning that way and then also the surrounding areas and things like that. And just getting used to the idea of fire being around and a tool, and as opposed to something, because it's hard to unlearn that Smokey the Bear program was tremendously effective. He's one of the most recognizable faces in advertising. And so getting people to know that there's such a thing as good fire that's where we're trying to steer that ship. And so development's really changed the game for us, because, fire doesn't care that there's a structure over here or a community there or a border or a fence line or anything like that. It's just going to spread. So that has to change a little bit too, like community planning and things like that. And also people that are living in these systems close to in the forest or near these wildlands to take matters in their own hands, and reduce the fuels in their surrounding areas on private land and their neighbors' lands and things like that, butting up to these national forests and national grasslands and state lands and everything else. So fourth and final is, if all that weren't enough, now we're experiencing climate change. So like I mentioned before, this is the first slow season we've had in about a decade, at least for California, for sure. And it used to be to the point where we're not even calling them fire seasons anymore. We're going to start calling them fire years, because I was on the Thomas fire and we went home Christmas Eve. I've been down in Southern California many times in January and February for to help staff things down there, because they've still got Santa Ana winds and very dry conditions. And then, I was back east in Tennessee and North Carolina when the Gatlinburg fire happened. And I was there over Thanksgiving. So like this time of year, a couple of years back. So it's becoming more and more of a thing where we're fighting fire year round. And it's not to say that we're not going to have, wet years like we just had. They're just going to be further and far between. That's the predictions anyways. So, we're up against a big uphill battle, and I don't know what's exactly the answer, the right thing, but we're going all in on fuels management and trying to manage the forest with prescribed fire. Mm-hmm. We do make mechanical entries a lot of times first, where we go in with chainsaws or equipment if it's not so steep, massacators and chippers and things like that. But oftentimes it's just boots on the ground with chainsaws making piles and, doing that first entry so we can moderate the intensity of the fire, because we can't just let fire just go back in there. It's got at times like 100 years accumulated where it hasn't had a chance to burn. It's been suppressed. And so, we got to go in there and manipulate it. Again, there's not a lot of money for that, because the benefit is not realized in board
dollars.
Feet.
Yeah. Right.
So I'll go in there, physically build piles, and that's usually the first entry. And we burn those piles the next year, give them a chance to dry out, and then we'll come back in and do an understory burn after that and try to focus on the fuel that's been left behind after those piles got burnt. And then keep that up, go in there every couple of years and let it do that. Or especially if it's a natural cause fire, and it enters these systems, is just let it do its thing in there. And we have pre-made fire breaks in some areas from past suppression actions, and we use those as points to kind of keep them checked and within the bounds of these areas that are close to communities and things like that.
Yeah, that's crazy. So hey, thanks for coming on, man. We're coming up on our hour here, but I just kind of want to close things out, and maybe what advice would you have for people that are living in these rural areas that are kind of stuck in they're stuck in between having to burn their property to keep it safe, but that's not something that they want to do or really even accept, because they don't, like you just said, no one thinks fire is a good thing.
It's, it was hard to change the hearts and minds back in the day too. Yeah. And it's going to take some time to do that here. And it all depends on, showing them what successful prescribed fire programs do, right? So these communities that are accepting this and are moving towards, this fuels management here on their landscapes in their neighborhoods, that's something to point to. They look, this is what we can do if we all kind of agree on it and get used to this. So that, some places don't really have a wildfire concern, but lots of places do. If you're in the inner city, that's structure fire. You're not worried about vegetation. But if you're in the wildland or butted up against it, we call the urban interface, then it is your problem, because if you don't do it, Mother Nature is going to do it. And Mother Nature's terms are much more brutal than our terms. And you can definitely mechanically do it. You don't need to do fire. Fire is just, especially if you have large swaths of land, is the quickest, fastest way you can take care of that fuel that's left on the ground. You can cut it, chop it up, load it in a truck, and take it someplace. You can definitely do that, but that's really expensive and labor intensive. But if you own a small piece of property, that's probably all you should do. There's no need to do an understory burn, maybe a pile burn on your property. Like I said, like we do for debris fires, collect that stuff, put it in a pile, burn it. Many people do that out here. But you're talking like some other areas, and not all lands are private lands. Some are owned by the state, other entities, and you're talking like ranches and things like that. But you're also talking about private timber companies. Timber companies own large swaths of land, and they do some fire management. And oftentimes in the late season, they burn those slash piles after it had a good rain, or sometimes they even do it in the snow. So they're managing it that way. But sometimes those open living stands, they still need to reintroduce fire into those systems too. But it's complicated. It's dangerous. Mm-hmm. It can be done right, but it's you got to really watch out for the right kind of conditions, how fast the wind is blowing, that kind of stuff. Because there also, for all these successes we have, which are the vast majority of them, there are some terrible outcomes where prescribed fire has escaped and it's burned up a town or killed somebody. And for every one of those, there's 100 ones that go off really good, but those ones are the ones that make the news. Those are the ones that people remember, mm-hmm. and for good reason. Mm-hmm. But that's the thing we got to try to avoid. But yeah, basically what we're faced with is do you want wildfire, which is in the name, right? Wildfire, uncontrolled, can't do anything about it, or you want controlled fire, prescribed fire, and you can't have none of it. Mm-hmm. You get one or you get the other. Mm-hmm. So which one do you want to deal with? And that's basically what we're kind of faced with.
Perfect. That's a great way to end it. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, no problem.